Welcome to today's event on the politics of international media rankings. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. This is part of our Harriman Institute series on human rights in the post-communist sphere, actors, strategies, and outcomes, co-hosted and co-directed by Jack Snyder in the Columbia Department of Political Science and myself. This is one branch of the project seeks to identify some of the politics surrounding the proliferation of rankings and indices. And so we had an event on the politics of corruption rankings in October. We will have another event next week on the politics of illicit indicators and the contested politics of numbers that will feature Peter Andreas of Brown University, Sally Mary of NYU, and our own Laura Nettlefield, amongst others. So this is an ongoing theme over the next year or so, and we're delighted to have you be part of it. Now, today's panel is remarkably distinguished, and it combines academics, practitioners, but both the academics and practitioners seem to do both. And so that's a really nice aspect of this. So let me introduce them briefly in the order that they'll be speaking. Lee Becker is director of the James M. Cox Jr. Center for International Mass Communication Training and Research and professor in the Department of Journalism, Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, University of Georgia. Professor Becker has written extensively on audience uses of the mass media and the effects of media messages on audience members and on society. He is the author of 2 books using mass communication theory with Maxwell McCombs and The Training and Hiring of Journalists with Jeffrey Fruit and Suzanne Caudill. He's co-editor of A Lot More and the contributor to many edited volumes and also author of dozens of journal articles. So it's a great pleasure to have him here, and he has also published extensively on the topic today: media rankings, media indicators, and cross comparisons of them. He has many prizes and distinctions. Just read a few of them. He's the recipient of the Distinguished Research Award of the Ohio State University, the Presidential Award, and the Kriegbaum Award of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, the Harold L. Nelson Award of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Wisconsin, amongst others. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Becker here. Dr. Karin Karlekar is Senior Research and Managing Editor of Freedom of the Press Survey at Freedom House here in New York. This is the Freedom of the Press, an annual index that tracks trends in media freedom worldwide. She coordinates the research, ratings, and editorial process for the index and also writes a number of the country reports. In addition, she led the development of the methodology for and coordinated the pilot edition of a new index of internet and digital media freedom published in April 2009. Very apropos given our discussions about what Facebook and Twitter did or did not do in Egypt and in Tunisia lately. Maybe we can get into that. And she regularly serves as a spokesperson for Freedom House on media issues. Amongst a lot of the research she's done in many parts of the world. She's traveled extensively in Asia and Africa, and prior she was an editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit and also served as a consultant at Human Rights Watch. She also holds a PhD in Indian history from Cambridge University in England, so we're delighted to have her. And then Ann Nelson, incredibly distinguished in both areas. Professor Nelson also teaches here at the School of International and Public Affairs, teaches new media in development communications, and she specializes in the area of international media development, and she has been an analyst and evaluator practitioner in the field. She consults for many leading U.S. foundations and also was executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, so she understands the topic very well. She's written extensively on media, conflict, and human rights, a war correspondent in Latin America, reported from East Europe and Asia, with work appearing in New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Harper's, the BBC. Her writing has won 6 awards, including the Livingston Award for International Reporting. What I hadn't realized is that Ann is also a widely produced playwright and screenwriter. Her 2001 play, The Guys, deals with the post-9/11 experience, has been produced throughout the U.S. and in 14 countries. and the screenplay became a 2002 feature film starring Sigourney Weaver and Anthony LaPaglia. She's a graduate of Yale University, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the recipient of a 2005 Guggenheim Fellowship for work on media and Nazi Germany. Welcome to you all. So what we'll do is we'll have each speaker go about 20 minutes in their presentation, 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open it up for discussion and Q&A from the audience. After that, please note that everything today is on the record, so if you decide to ask a question, please state your affiliation, and you will be recorded for historical record. So, welcome.
Thank you, Alex, for the very kind introduction. It's truly a pleasure and truly an honor to be here at the Harriman Institute and to join my two colleagues in this panel. I look forward to learning from them and learning from those of you in the audience, and I hope I can contribute a little bit to the dialogue. The politics of international media rankings, the title of this presentation today, is a topic of great interest to me. And that particular configuration, that is the politics of the ranking, I think is particularly interesting question to pose. I apologize to Karin for this. She knows the story, but I thought I would start by telling a little bit about how I first got interested in the rankings. And as a media scholar, media freedom of the press and freedom of the media is obviously something that's almost throughout my 40-year career been of value and interest. And I think probably from the very early years of the Freedom House measures, I was aware of those measures and had at least some passing interest in them. But my interest became acute nearly 10 years ago now, when I was asked by John Bear, who was then the director of research at the Knight Foundation in Miami, if I thought that there was some work that could be done to validate and critically examine the indicators with the goal of using these indicators in evaluation work. The foundation was interested in knowing what the impact of media assistance projects were, in particularly the post-1990 period, and was interested in learning whether these indicators could be used as a way of determining whether the media assistance investment was producing an outcome in terms of a higher quality, more independent media. And of course, the ultimate goal is to understand whether the media played some role in the furtherance of democratization. So I confess that I was skeptical about the indicators when I first started to look at them. I saw them as embedded in a political process and not the outcome of scientific inquiry, and I was concerned that that political process contaminated them and in fact would limit the utility of the indicators. My view has in fact changed rather markedly over time. In fact, it changed rather quickly as we started working on an assessment of the evaluators. So what I hope to explain to you in my time today is why that's the case, and talk to you about some of the research that we have done to look at the indicators. So what my colleague Tudor Vlad and our students have done is subject the press freedom indices to standard analysis using the criteria of reliability and validity. And this is obviously rather straightforward, but it's something that had not been done, as far as we know, in any systematic way before we began to ask that question. We focused primarily on the Freedom House measure, which is the oldest, and Karin is going to give you a little background on it for those of you who don't know too much about it. We also looked at the Reporters Without Borders, or Reporters Sans Frontières measure, which is, I think, safe to say, was developed in part as a response to the prominence of and presumed bias of the American, or the American bias of the American indicators. And we've also have looked at measures that have been developed subsequently by IREX, an NGO in Washington. We also did look at data gathered by the Committee to Protect Journalists, although I'm not going to talk about that here today. And more recently, we have looked at the indicator from the African Media Barometer Project, which is interesting because it was developed in Africa by African scholars with the attempt to develop an indigenous measure, not necessarily reflective of the concerns of NGOs such as those in Paris and in Washington. So the first question we asked was of the reliability of the measures, and what we found is that in fact, for all of these indicators, they are reliable across time, and as would be expected, the reliability decreases in a systematic fashion across time. That is, the year-to-year correlations are much higher than they are as one moves across time. Obvious expectation if the measures are going to at first reliably or consistently measure a phenomenon and then reflect change. We also found that in the case in which there are sub-indices, that is for Freedom House and for IREX, that the internal dimensions are internally consistent and yet not identical, so they pick up some additional meaning through the sub-indices. In the case of the African Media Barometer, we could not look at measures across time because it's a relatively new indicator, but we have shown that that indicator, although it was developed to be distinct from the Western indicators, in fact, correlates very highly with those Western indicators in the time period for which the data are available. We also have made some preliminary, I would say rather simple attempts at validation via hypothesis testing or construct validation. We have used the Freedom House measure to look at the nature of change in the areas of the world where change should have been dramatic in key periods of time. We looked at the way the measure changed as the Soviet Union dissolved, and in fact it meaningfully reflects that change. And we also looked at the Warsaw Pact countries as they became more independent and moved into the Western sphere. And again, the Freedom House measure was our focus because it's the only one that existed through that period of time, and it accurately reflects the expected change period. We also have been working with a hypothesis that we have that comes out of the competition literature, particularly the media competition literature. We have hypothesized that there are high levels of competition in a media environment is dysfunctional from the point of view of the media product. It is probably functional in the ways in which economists look at competition. That is, it's probably the case that the stronger media products survive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the products that survive are those which are advantageous from the point of view of democratic development. We hypothesize that high levels of competition should be associated with low levels of press performance. And we certainly were expecting that the relationship, if it were not curvilinear, at least would not be a linear positive relationship. And to test that hypothesis, we used measures from IREX as a sub-index that IREX has. It focuses on journalistic performance. And the data are largely supportive of the expectation. We've also tried to build some simple theoretical statements about the relationship of press freedom and democratization. We have a simple model which reflects, I think, the assumptions that exist both in the academic literature and in the media assistance area. And we have tried to simply lay out the premises into a very, very elementary model. But part of the goal is to move away from simply methodological assessment and move into the area of more theoretical assessment of the indices. We have a chapter coming out in a book with Peter Lang in a series that I edited that contains our premises about what the relationship between media independence ought to be, the relationship between media assistance and media independence ought to be, and more importantly, what the relationship between media independence and democratization should be. And I can say as an important aside that Jack Snyder's work focusing on the role that the media have played in some very disruptive environments, particularly Rwanda, I think is particularly important in terms of understanding the complexity of media independence and its potential role in democratization. And as a result of that work, we have tried to argue that you must have a number of conditions for media independence and freedom to produce a democratic outcome. And again, the work of Jack Snyder has been particularly important. There's emerging literature on particularly Rwanda, as you probably know, that treats the case of media independence there as a very important case study. More recently, we have turned our attention to public opinion as a means of validating media freedom and media independence measures. These indicators originally were called press freedom. I'm trying to use media freedom as the more appropriate term, but historically, and I think even today, they're called press freedom measures. That is in the case of RSF and Freedom House. Now, there are two related, but I think separable reasons why public opinion is worth examining in relationship to media freedom indices. The first is the validity reason, that is, elite evaluators, and all of these indicators are based on the work of elites who try to assess the media, that elite evaluators might simply get it wrong, and it's important to have data from the people who are using the media every day. The second reason is that even if the elite evaluators have it right, I think it's worth asking the question as to whether or not an assessment of the media system would not be more complete if it also included measures from the public. That is to say, shouldn't it be important, if we want to understand a media system, to know that the public also shares the view of the elite evaluators, that is, thinks that the media are free and has confidence in them? And would it not be the case that a system that was evaluated as free or independent from the point of view of the evaluators who largely focus on constraints would be a less meritorious system than one, but did not have the support of the public, would be a less meritorious system than one that had both elite and public assessments of freedom? What we argue then is, or wanting to argue, and what we are trying to look at with our data is the question as to whether or not we should not build into, in the future, into these indices, public assessments of trust and confidence. And I'm going to show you some data that speak to that point. The second argument then I think is a rather important one, and I'll come to it in the end, come back to it in the end. Turn a little bit now to some of our public opinion data, and that's what I will focus on for the remaining time of my presentation. Where we started was with a couple of very small data sets. We don't have the resources to do to field public opinion surveys around the world in order to ask people about their assessments of the media. So we have been searching for data sets that speak to that point, and we found a BBC World Service poll back in 2007 from 14 countries, and you can see that the questions there. I actually was going to read that question to you, but I tried to read it when I was preparing, and I realized how contorted it is. And so I'll let you try to read it yourself to see the complexity of the question. It is, in fact, scored in a reverse way as it's shown there. And what we looked at is the relationship between that measure and the Freedom House measures. We use both Pearson and Spearman, Pearson's R and Spearman Rowe. You can see that it's a relatively modest correlation of only 0.31 in the Pearson case and 0.23 in the Spearman Rowe case, probably the more appropriate case given the small number. We also found a data set from World Public Opinion in 2008 with a measure that I think is much more satisfactory. It says, how much freedom does the media have in your country? A lot, not very much, none at all. And here the Pearson R is actually quite robust, 0.81, Spearman 0.76. Because we had these two data sets and they were not showing the same thing, we took the 8 cases where the data were, in fact, the question was posed in those same 8 countries, and there's no relationship between them. So we would like to conclude, and we think we have some data that will allow us to conclude that the BBC measure is not a particularly good one. We had the good fortune of being in touch with some people at Gallup working on the Gallup World Poll, which, as you probably know, is now fielded in more than 150 countries. Our entities around the world. Some of them are not countries. Puerto Rico is a separate country in the Gallup World Poll, but so be it. At any rate, 150 different units in which the poll is conducted, and there are core of items that are used across all of the Gallup World Poll surveys. In some countries, the poll is fielded more than once a year, and it's been fielded, I think, as many as 6 or 8 times in some countries, and sometimes it's 1 or 2, and in most cases it's 1 time a year. But there are a core number of items that they try to use in all of those countries. Now, they can't use them in all cases because in some cases they're simply not allowed by the government. In some cases, their field organization won't use them. It says that they can't actually be asked. What we were able to do is to get an item into the core for 2010 that says, do the media in this country have a lot of freedom or not? We actually suggested the World Public Opinion item to them, but this is the variant that they were willing to field. They say that many of the countries, the surveyors, survey organizations, and the field staff have very, very strong preference for either or items, and this is the variant that came out. So in 2010, that item appeared for the first time in the core, and we have data now for more than 100 countries, but I got the data for about 50 of them only 2 days ago. So we have data for 48 that I can show you here today. And I'm just going to show you a series of scatter plots. You can, if you've got really good eyes, you can see some of the countries there. But what we're looking at here in this first chart is the relationship between the RSF, Reporters Without Borders measure, and press freedom of press freedom in 2010 and the Gallup data for 2010. Obviously, at this point, we have no idea what kind of lag might be appropriate. We only have data for 1 year in terms of the Gallup data, so we looked at the 10 by 10 relationship, and the R is negative 43, which is a positive 43. We have respected the preferences of RSF and Freedom House for negative scoring, and consequently, a negative is a positive in the analysis. And you can see the pattern. You can see some outliers. And I'm just going to go very quickly through this, but this is the 9 by 10 relationship. That is taking press freedom measure from 2009 with the Gallup data for 2010. Again, the only year for which we have data. Although we will have more, that item has remained in the core for 2011, and so will be fielded throughout this year as well. And the correlation is very comparable, 0.44. So a modest correlation. More encouraging is the correlation with the Freedom House measure from 2009 with the Gallup measure from 2010. And we're waiting on Karin's report for 2010 to see what happens when we go year by year. It makes some sense that there would be a lag, but as I said, we have no theoretical argument about what that lag should be. You can see there are some interesting outliers, and these would be the cases in which we would say that a measure of public opinion would contribute to the understanding of press freedom. That is, if you look at Cambodia, Lithuania, these are falling down at the top and at the bottom. There's a discrepancy, they're falling off the axis. And so the public is disagreeing with the elites in those cases. Now, we conclude preliminarily that this is further evidence that there's a link between elite evaluations of the media and public assessments. So there's some evidence of superiority of the Freedom House measure that comes from this. I'm sure that Karin won't be unhappy to hear that, but she's heard that before. But in fact, maybe we haven't sent you this paper yet, so maybe you don't know that. But at any rate, the difference isn't great, but you know, it's in the right direction. And there are still some important limitations. There's a small number of countries, and Europe was not in the set. We're missing the 2010 measure from Freedom House. We're relying on the single measure from Gallup. It's all that we could get into the core. We felt awfully blessed to get that in. But because we're dealing with a single measure, there's no way to standardize that measure, so we have no sense about national differences in terms of response patterns or codes, use of the codes. And we really haven't had the chance yet to look at differences in the political environment, which may have some impact on that relationship. And I'm going to talk to you in a moment about some cases where we have done that. So, as I said, we have data now for about another 50 countries. We will be analyzing those. We hope we're presenting a paper about them in Istanbul this summer. We proposed a paper. We've been really, really fortunate to have a chance to work with Gallup on this. I'm on, with Tudor and I are on the advisory board for Gallup World Poll for their media questions, and we're very, very thankful that we've had that opportunity. We've been working with a woman named Cynthia English, and she's been an author of the work that I just spoke about and the work I'm going to speak about now, so I want to acknowledge her contribution. She's a research scientist with Gallup in Nebraska. So I'm going to just close by going very quickly through another data set in which we're looking at a confidence measure. Gallup, in that core, up until 2011, had this cluster of items. Do you have confidence in each of the following or not? Military, judicial system or courts, national government, healthcare or medical systems, financial institutions or banks, religious organizations, and integrity of the media. Now, they don't include all of those items in all countries, but usually the case is that they will have 7. 3 is common in some of the countries. Again, they can ask questions in certain cases. What we have is data from about 2 or 3 countries for 2007, 8, and 9, and we will have 2010. That item was in the core in 2010, but it has been bumped for 2011. We haven't analyzed anything from 2010 yet. But what we have done in this case is we have standardized the confidence measure across the set. That is, we are looking now not at the absolute level of confidence, but at confidence relative to the other institutions. And I'm going to show you just 5 scatter plots. And the first one is a zero-order relationship, and it shows you nothing. And in fact, it's consistent with what has been done with analysis that Gallup first did and we did with 2005 and 6, where there were a smaller number of countries. At the zero order, there is surprisingly no relationship between confidence in the media and the level of political freedom. We looked for ways in which we might disentangle that relationship. We thought there might be a variable masking the relationship. We were hopeful that was the case. And we looked at several measures. We were encouraged by Gallup to look at this particular item, although we looked at others. It says, in your opinion, how many people in your country, if any, are afraid to openly express their political views? Now, Gallup likes the question because they're not asking about yourself, so you get away from this pride or unwillingness to say that you're constrained, you're pushing it off on somebody else, but you're saying, yeah, people around here are really afraid. And we used that to divide our 100 countries, 110 countries, into 4 clusters, roughly quartiles, to look at the relationship between press freedom and confidence in those 4 different political arenas. Now, again, it's negative scored here, so positive is a negative. And so when fear of political expression is very low, such as you can see here in New Zealand, Denmark, Netherlands, I think the US is in that cluster, there's actually a negative relationship between press freedom and confidence. Okay? When, again, the positive is a negative because of the reverse scoring. When the fear of political expression is a little bit more, but still there's not much of it, you have a little bit less of a relationship of the negative relationship, but still one existing. When the fear becomes higher, the relationship turns negative and stays negative, although it's a little bit more mitigated in the high fear environment. So that variable, the fear, has masked the original relationship, and we do in fact then find that there is a relationship between confidence in the media and press freedom. We've used the Freedom House measures here. We've also used Reporters Without Borders. The relationships are much the same. We've used Spearman's and Pearson's. It doesn't really change the picture very much. So we think the analysis provide further evidence of the validity of the measures of press freedom by linking them to public opinion. They also show the value of exploring the relationship of media system characteristics with other characteristics of society, including public opinion measures. And we think the undertaking will be complex, but a systematic measure of media systems probably should include both elite measures as the current Freedom House RSF measures, IREX measures do, as well as public opinion assessments. If you want copies of the paper, you can either go to the Cox Center website. There's a conference paper section, and there are a number of papers. You'll recognize them by titles, I think. And you also could just send me an email message, and I'd be glad to send you whichever papers were of interest to you. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thanks, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I'd like to thank the Harriman Center and Alex and Jack for inviting me to speak today. I've tried to make my presentation a little bit different than normal because Lee and I keep speaking on panels together, so he's very bored with my standard talk by now, I think. So I've tried to focus in on this presentation. I'll start off with a short overview of our Freedom House Index for those of you who may not know too much about it, but then I wanted to focus mostly on looking at the impact of the index, how it's used, and sort of some of the media coverage, how governments respond to it, and some of the more practical sort of day-to-day things as looking at this topic as a practitioner rather than as an academic. First, as a sort of overview of the whole field of media indicators, I just wanted to clarify that the Freedom House Index, as well as other indices, are not sort of surveys as people might think of them in terms of, let's say, going out and surveying hundreds of respondents in each country and then having numerical ratings that are based on surveys. So the Freedom House Index, as well as all other indices that we'll be discussing, and Lee has mentioned these already, are basically we all produce quantitative data, but it is produced through qualitative means, I would say. And so we produce these numerical ratings, but they are not, in many cases, tied to specific indicators or data points. For example, let's say looking at the number of news outlets in a country, or as I said, a traditional survey of respondents. Their numerical scores are given on the basis of expert judgments, on the basis of questions asked in the methodology of each index. And each index has a slightly different way of going about this, which I can get into a little bit more in the Q&A if people are interested. Looking at the field as a whole, I think we can divide the indices out there into two basic categories. One is press freedom indices, and these were developed primarily for advocacy purposes. I'd put Freedom House and RSF into this category. We both cover the legal environment for media, political issues, and economic issues as part of our methodology questions. RSF, I would say, focuses a little bit more on the political category and particularly on attacks and violence against journalists. So when you look at the discrepancies between our ratings for certain countries, I would say probably 80 or 90% will fall roughly in the same category, and the major discrepancies are really seen for countries which have very high murder rates against journalists. So countries such as Russia, Sri Lanka, the Philippines will measure much worse on the RSF index than our index. On the other side, we have media sustainability or development indicators, and these were developed slightly different set, or more as a diagnostic tool. And under this category, I'd put IREX's Media Sustainability Index, the newer Africa and Asia media barometers, which, as Lee mentioned, are sort of locally produced and conceptualized. And then the newest one is, UNESCO doesn't actually produce numbers, but they do produce a new set of studies called, it's sort of looking at a media development indicator. So they are looking at a lot of the same questions, but they don't provide numbers, they provide narrative reports. I would say these indicators focus on the legal and political, but they also focus a lot more on issues of economic sustainability, and there's also greater attention given to issues of media professionalism, which we do not cover so much in our index. Turning specifically to focus on the Freedom House Index, just a few basics. We have been conducting the process for, this will be the 31st year this year, so it is the longest running index. Currently we produce analytical reports and numerical ratings. and it's 196 countries and territories. This year we will be expanding, and we have expanded in recent years to add in countries like Kosovo. Probably next year South Sudan will be another addition. So it is expanding all the time. And we are one of the main organizations that does both country reports for every country as well as numerical indicators, which are linked together. RSF focuses more on the numbers when they put out their index, but they don't really have narrative reports that are directly tied into those numbers. In our index, we give each country a status designation of free, partly free, or not free. We give them a numerical rating based on our set of methodology questions on a 0 to 100 scale, and then we also rank them on a global scale. So that started a few years ago, and countries are ranked on that level as well. We also produce an annual map of press freedom, which has the countries colored according to status. And that's one of the things I think that we're best known for, and is one of the things we use as an advocacy tool. Turning to what the Freedom House Index measures, what we really try and capture with our methodology questions are two main sort of baskets, I would say. One is the media's ability to operate freely and without fear of repercussions, and the ability of the public to access diverse and independent sources of news information. We try and cover a very wide range of factors. We look at the role of the state as well as at non-state actors. We look at impact of media owners and editors, insurgent groups, and pretty much any other type of political, economic, or societal force that could impact media content or practice. So we really try and measure the entire enabling environment for media freedom, rather than focusing in more on things like attacks. And we divide this into legal, political, and economic categories. The index also does cover, at the moment, print, broadcast, and increasingly internet and new media freedom. And we do sort of try and update our methodology and tweak it a little bit to take into account the changing media environment in many countries. In terms of our exact scoring process, as I said, we have a 0 to 100 scale, and it's negatively, I guess, done. So higher numbers indicate less freedom, and the closer you get to 0, the better you are in terms of your media freedom score. Currently, our set of 23 methodology questions, we divide them into these 3 categories. As you can see, the categories are pretty evenly weighted, although political is slightly more on a 0 to 40 point scale. And as Lee mentioned, we do also divide, we have sub, I guess, totals for each of these 3 categories. So scholars can look at our overall numerical rating for a country as well as the ratings for these 3 categories. Within our methodology, each question that we have receives a different weighting. So broader questions concerning editorial control, for example, and violence and attacks are weighted the most. Those questions, a country could get a potential score of between 0 and 10 points. Specific questions receive the least weight, and countries, let's say, would get a score between 0 and 2 points. So we have questions in the legal category on freedom of information legislation and on libel, and those are much more specific questions. A full set of our methodology questions and all the issues that we look at are available online if people are interested in the methodology. And then based on the numerical score, we, as I said, give this category breakdown of free, partly free, and not free. In terms of looking at how the scores and reports are produced, we have analysts who usually write between 3 and 6 country reports. They do all the research, they write the draft reports, and they also do the draft scoring for each country. I would say about 1/3 at the moment are written by Freedom House staff, and 2/3 are written by consultants. And many are based in the United States, but some are based internationally, either in the countries or regions that they cover. Once the analysts, actually right now is the time of year when the analysts are all working on their drafts, we then in March hold review meetings for each region where we gather all the analysts and our regional advisors together, and we talk about the scores and go through all the scoring, and then we reach consensus about what the score should be for each country. And then we also, after that, go into an extensive fact-checking and editorial process in-house to complete the final product. I'll turn now to how all the indices are used. This relates to Freedom House as well as some of the other indices, although I'm talking more here about because I know more about how our own index is used. So I'll divide this into several categories. One is as a research tool. Because of the extensive time period and data set of the Freedom House Index, it's extensively used by academics in order to run correlations between media issues and other themes such as corruption, economic development, political transition, a number of different issues. It's also being used currently by the World Bank as a part of its governance indicator data sets. In terms of the advocacy uses of the index, which is, I think, the reason why we started it, as well as RSF, we're widely quoted by media outlets, both at the time that we release the annual index in May and throughout the year if there's an issue that develops in a certain country. Many local outlets will pick up our index. It's used extensively by activists in countries. They will cite our index in court cases when they're trying to push for reform or to highlight issues within their country as sort of an international, well-respected standard indicator. And it can provide a way for both local activists and for us as a Western or international NGO to engage with governments. Further uses of the index are as a diagnostic tool. It's used by donors and media development organizations, so groups like USAID, DFID, use the indices to track the success and impact of their own media programs. And this is a somewhat problematic usage, which I can get into more in the Q&A if people are interested. The Broadcasting Board of Governors and Voice of America use the index to determine their broadcasting priorities for overseas US-funded broadcasting. The Millennium Challenge Corporation also uses the index to inform its foreign aid decisions. The corporate sector uses the index as a diagnostic tool as well. Groups like Google and Yahoo use our reports to inform their own internal human rights impact assessments. And this is obviously getting, I think, more important as those types of companies get even more prominence in terms of what's going on in the world today and the information flows globally. Lee's talked a lot about Gallup, but Gallup has also been using Freedom House data a little bit more, and academics such as Lee have been using the two sets of data to look at these correlations. I won't talk too much about that because we heard about it from Lee. So one example of the impact is in terms of US government-funded foreign broadcasting. I'm just mentioning a few cases from the last few years that I know about. This was several years ago, probably about 5 years ago, but the Broadcasting Board of Governors used Freedom House index numbers to justify cutting language services by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty to the Baltic states and Central Europe. And their main argument was that these countries' scores were the same or similar to the score for the United States. And there was a lot of pushback from some people, in the countries, but, and I actually got called about it and people were asking me, so that was sort of an interesting case. This past year, renewed funding for U.S. broadcasting to Asia, which is Radio Free Asia, was justified in a bill proposed by Senator Lugar in the Senate, and a major part of the bill used Freedom House scores to talk about the low press freedom ratings for a number of Asian countries, and was used as a justification for continuing and expanding RFA services to the region. Another example of impact concerns the Millennium Challenge account, and this has affected our press freedom survey as well as some of the other Freedom House indices. The MCA is a US government aid instrument that awards money based on a set of performance indicators, including human rights and good governance. Freedom House, media freedom indicators, and our other indexes such as Freedom in the World are some of the factors that feed into making these judgments. And there have been several cases of countries being denied aid packages due to declines in press freedom, and it's been explicitly stated. So both for the Gambia and Sri Lanka, these countries were denied aid packages based on declines in their numerical scores in our index. And the use of Freedom House scores by the MCC has led, I would say, over the last 5 years or so to much more attention being given to our ratings by governments. Looking at that a little more, what that's meant for us on the ground and on a daily basis is that we're getting many more requests from government officials for meetings to discuss the ratings, and also offers to provide us with positive information, reforms that are going on, telling us it's not so bad, that we don't have the information right, things like that. And so mostly it's our executive staff, but sometimes the rest of us get pulled into these meetings to hear from them, to try and defend what we've said. And in some cases, I think that they're more interested in a dialogue, and some, they're not really interested in a dialogue, but they're still trying to get their money from the MCA. I would say mostly this concerns mid-range or cusp countries such as Jordan, Morocco, Armenia, and Cameroon. And it's the worst of the worst performers are not really the ones trying to engage in dialogue with us. But some, I would say, I mean, we had a meeting actually with the foreign minister of the Maldives. This was when they were trying to push for reforms in the Maldives, and they were actually very interested in hearing about what we would recommend or how they could improve their score. Looking at media coverage, which is also very interesting, and it's been expanding over the last few years. There are definitely some typical patterns that we see every year, some of which are quite amusing. In some countries, for example, media coverage is used, I would say mostly by the state-owned media, to drive attention to a neighbor's bad score. So we have a case of Armenia and Azerbaijan who are still locked in mortal combat. And usually every year we find Azerbaijani media outlets putting out stories about Freedom House has rated Armenia as not free, and not really drawing any attention to what their own score is, which is actually worse than Armenia's score. I'll show you a copy in a minute. Actually, I can go forward right now. So this is a screenshot of News AZ. They usually put this kind of thing out every year, focusing on what our score is for Armenia, which is quite funny. Hopefully you guys can see some of the text. Look, Russia is another very interesting case where they are actively trying to discredit Freedom House and make us look silly in the news coverage that comes out from Russia. More from the state-controlled media, definitely. There are actually some more independent outlets in Russia that have used our index to talk about what the declines have been in Russia, but looking at the state-controlled media coverage, there are three definite themes that usually come out. One is about Freedom House being a U.S. government-controlled entity and an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. One is sort of looking at the broad category designations and the fact that, they say, well, Freedom House rates Russia the same as North Korea. How can that be? That's ridiculous. That means Freedom House is silly. And then the third thing they often try and do is make comments like, Russia's ranked the same as this African country. How ridiculous is that? How could we be the same as an African country? So this is a typical article by Pravda, sort of going on about how Freedom House is a U.S. government-controlled entity and things like that. And if people are interested in these, I can send copies in case you can't see them. On the positive side, I would say that the Freedom House Index is used by both local media and civil society groups to highlight declines in media freedom or new threats in their own countries. And in the past year, we saw two big issues in which our index was really picked up and the Freedom House ratings were highlighted in terms of local media coverage. So one is in South Africa, where we actually downgraded South Africa to partly free in last year's index based on things that had already been happening. And then there were two big threats in South Africa this year. One was a protection of information bill, and then there's a government idea to set up a media council, which would be sort of a statutory regulation of the media. These two developments have been loudly and vociferously opposed by the South African media and by press freedom groups, both local and international, and a lot of them picked up the fact that we had already downgraded South Africa and that we had these concerns. So that was a very positive use of our ratings and numbers, and has actually led to stalling on both of these measures by the South African government. Similarly this year, I think this started in around June, but Hungary passed a very restrictive media bill in several stages, which was finally passed in September. There was a lot of attention to this by Freedom House, other press freedom groups, and the EU sustain, and this has actually led, I think, to the government recently to promise amending the new law. So that's been very positive. But so both of these, I think, are sort of positive impacts in the use of our index. Local press freedom organizations also use our scores as part of their advocacy work. So in Thailand, a local press freedom group submitted, it was actually part of a libel case against an editor. This was 4 or 5 years ago, and they submitted to the court as part of the case an amicus curiae brief, and they cited our Freedom House Index as showing that there had been a huge decline in Thailand's press freedom, and so that was submitted as part of the evidence to the court. Last year, the Hong Kong Journalists Association used our downgrade of Hong Kong the year before to highlight that in their own annual report and to try and draw attention to these issues in Hong Kong. And this is a screenshot from Thailand, which cited our report. This is a Hungary one, and this is our article on African media, which was using our map and our index. So yeah, so it's so I think there are both positive and negative uses and impacts. Just a few summarizing thoughts. In general, much of the media coverage, as well as critiques from governments or individuals, are of our broader category designations. So they'll say, well, how can this country be ranked as not free, and sort of looking at the big picture. In most cases, this happens without much knowledge of or interested in the numerical score or in our methodology questions and how a country would end up at a certain score or rating. While the category designations and the map are useful for advocacy purposes and getting the big picture at a glance, I would definitely recommend more knowledge of the methodology, the actual numerical scores, and our scoring process when people are using the index to make more nuanced decisions, for example, regarding funding or the impact of programs, or obviously for academic research. So I will end it there to leave more time for questions and Q&A. And we do have maps and booklets over there if anyone would like to grab a copy after the session, and I'm available on email as well if people have questions afterwards. Thank you.
So I don't have a PowerPoint. My name is Ann Nelson. I teach here at CEPA. And I, about 20-some years ago, was presented with the challenge of helping to evolve some press freedom indicators in my position as the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I have to say that this field has come an awfully long way in a relatively short time. 20 years in my life is short. Let's think about where we were 20 or 30 years ago. It was really very much the atmosphere of the Cold War. And we had really a sense that the West was free, the East was not, and the rest of the world didn't entirely exist. And so working with that premise was very, very challenging. And at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we were very much a kind of ambulance service for journalists. We would get reports that a journalist was imprisoned, tortured, killed in a given country, and our job was to try to help them physically as quickly as possible. And so that was really how we began. As we went along, we found that, somewhat to our surprise, that we were gathering data. And we would have lists of the actions we had taken, and we would categorize it with our primitive computer systems of the mid-1980s and say, well, this data might have some kind of value. And we started getting more and more inquiries from academics and press representatives saying, well, what does your data mean? So we really were pressed by the audience for our information to codify it and interpret it. Now, this caused some problems because people would say, let's look at your computer printout, and 8 journalists were killed in the Philippines, but 20 journalists were imprisoned in Hungary, so which is freer, the Philippines or Hungary? And we'd say, well, how many people in prison equal how many people killed? We can't make any sense of that equation, right? And a lot of the press, the abuses of press freedom that we found were in other categories. Newspapers confiscated in Singapore, all right? Nuisance libel suits, right? So these were things that would chill press freedom. They had an effect. We protested them, we recorded them. But it wasn't a situation where we could put this data head to head and create a kind of hierarchy. So on my watch as director, one thing that we did was take these relatively primitive computer printouts that were incident reports. They almost look like a police blotter. And we said, all right, well, let's flesh them out. Let's do a little bit more storytelling so that we can try to figure out what they mean. So for example, if a journalist was beaten by police in a demonstration, that had one context. If the police went to his home and dragged him out of his home with his family and beat him there, that was much more intentional, and you could read the incident and start to draw a greater conclusion from the patterns of abuses. However, people would say, well, if it doesn't show up on your list, then it's fine. Well, Saudi Arabia looked great. North Korea was perfect, because there was really no press at that point functioning, so there were no abuses, no journalists who were really operating independently enough to get into trouble. It wasn't possible. So no one could look at the attacks on the press report in the late 1980s and come up with any kind of a sense of hierarchy of press freedom, and we always warned people not to do that. That's not what that report was. Nonetheless, especially in the media, people started doing it themselves and pushing us for rankings. And my approach to that, being very reluctant to issue reports on how many prisoners make a murder, was to create a list that we called countries of concern. And so we would highlight a list, I believe we started out with 10 or 12 countries, where we said these are countries where bad things are going on and possibly where there's a rate of change. It gets a little boring to report on North Korea because nothing ever happened in North Korea that was made the press very worth discussing rather than deploring. But there were other countries where there would be trends and patterns and events that would be quite drastic. Often these were linked to political occasions. So if you had a lot of political violence, if you had an insurgency, that often corresponded with an upsurge of journalist deaths. And you could see that very clearly over the years in countries like the Philippines, countries like Colombia, and sometimes we'd talk among ourselves as researchers and say it's almost like this pinball machine where certain countries light up from year to year. You might not draw certain conclusions from which countries showed up on that list. For example, the Philippines traditionally has a free press under many metrics because it has a very lively press. It reports very critically of the government and of business interests. It has a lot of issues, but the country has often had a tradition of extreme violence against the press. So we tried to come up with means of storytelling, I suppose, that would say, let's look at societies in their own terms, but have a set of absolutes that have to do with our reactions to press conditions. And obviously, murder and torture were very, very high on our list. We condemned those. It got very tricky in other areas, and we really had to struggle with issues of cultural relativism. This certainly applied to our colleagues. One of the shocking moments in my career was getting a copy of the equivalent of our attacks on the press report from the International Organization of Journalists in Prague in 1988. And what they had done was plagiarized our entire report, except they took out Nicaragua, Cuba, the Soviet Union, and the other countries in the bloc. They just removed them. But everything else was word for word. So I protested this event to them, and they apologized, and then things changed. It was also interesting to be present at the formation of Reporters Sans Frontières, or Reporters Without Borders, and that was born as something called the L'Observatoire in Montpellier, and their research methodology was based on surveying correspondence. And this is noted in Lee Becker's excellent paper that I just read before coming tonight, that I highly recommend. One thing that we noted was that the correspondents that they interviewed were from Agence France-Presse. Okay? Well, what do we know about that? French people like to read about former French colonies. So we found that the documentation of Francophone Africa was much more comprehensive than it was of Anglophone Africa. And it's not that you would necessarily look at that and say it's a political bias. It is simply a logistical data gathering reality. and I think that they're probably heavily reliant on Agence France Presse to this day. One thing that we did at the Committee to Protect Journalists was really try to interview a wide range of both foreign correspondents and local journalists in every country that we covered. So that, including Agence France Presse, but also many wire agencies and local and international press organizations. That was an interesting development. We also found very interesting variations in metrics. Now, the killed list was always the one that the media responded to. And one thing that you'll find with all of these reports is that you'll find some disparity in lists of journalists killed in a given year. If you drill down into that data, you'll find that different standards are used. And at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we tried to restrict it to people that we felt were killed pursuing their profession and in some way or other because they were pursuing their profession. That may sound obvious, but we would get into discussions, heated discussions, with colleagues at other organizations who would record journalists killed in the pursuit of their professions, but for what might be accidental reasons. So the example I remember was the journalist who was speeding to cover a story and ran a stoplight and got, had a collision. Well, he was on the job, but there was no suggestion that the car that hit him knew he was a journalist going to cover a story. It was a traffic accident, right? So that was the kind of data that was gathered by the more union-oriented organizations as opposed to the press freedom organizations. So as you see, it really may start out sounding simple, but very quickly it became not simple. Another issue that we continue to struggle with is access to participation. Even 20 years ago, it was difficult to determine quite often who was a journalist. So we had a case in China where Chinese dock workers created a mimeograph news organization that accompanied a strike. And they put out mimeographed messages, and they were distributed, and they were arrested, and they were beaten up. They were dock workers. They'd never made a cent as professional journalists. And we debated it internally for a while, and then we said, well, they didn't have the potential to become journalists under the political system they were working under. So for our purposes, if they were trying to function as journalists within their possibilities, we will count them as journalists. And this is something that I cover in my recent book, Red Orchestra, about Nazi Germany. I describe a circle of people who did not get a paycheck from a journalistic organization. They published Samizdat in Nazi Germany on mimeograph machines because that's all they could do. Some of them were former journalists who had lost their jobs because of the Nazi regulations. So this gets you into gray areas of data. But I do think that in order to be honest in evaluating it, you have to admit that these gray areas exist. So one thing that it's important to think about in looking at all of these indicators, which are extremely valuable, is also how they skew. So quite often, what they don't record are certain audiences that live in media dark zones of their countries and of the world. These indicators record the kinds of media that are available to people who tend to be literate and tend to have some disposable income. And if people do not belong to that sector in their countries, they may not really be present in these assessments. Who are these people? Well, in many countries, the very poor, in many countries, the illiterate, in many countries, women, in many countries, indigenous peoples. And in some countries, you might have indicators that say the press operates somewhat freely, but in a given language. I'm working right now on a report for the World Association of Newspapers that's looking in media markets, and one of the countries we're studying is Mozambique. High rate of illiteracy, and not a terrible record on media freedom, but the newspapers are published in Portuguese, which is only spoken by a very small minority of the people. So you have this whole world of indigenous populations who don't really have representation in a lot of these maps. They don't create media, they don't consume media, and so therefore their freedom is not fully measured within these parameters. It's a lot easier to measure media in print. Print stands still. It's very difficult to measure media such as talk radio. And sometimes I think that we get something of a distorted view of countries like China because so much of the energy in expression may be on platforms like talk radio, and nobody is there recording it. I don't even think it's probably possible to record it in any meaningful way. So if we look at the world of China as defined by the People's Daily, it looks like one picture. If you look at the talk radio environment of southern China, it looks different. And as I said, it's not necessarily a flaw of the metrics, but I think it's important to acknowledge what we're looking at. And of course the internet raises this problem to the nth degree. So here we have a methodology that is really advancing in some ways, but does not always take into account what some people call the bottom billion. In terms of the challenges moving forward, I think that we're going to be increasingly challenged to define what is media, what is the press, and who is a journalist. Egypt showed that to us many times over. For example, a lot of us before the session were saying we had our updates on Egypt on Facebook and on Twitter because that's where you could get it the fastest. Is a Facebook group journalism? Would a Facebook group reporting on the events in Egypt show up on a press freedom indicator? Would it show up on an internet freedom indicator? I don't know. I think it's something that we're probably going to have to wrestle with. And I've written about some of these issues for the Carnegie Reporter in an article called Arab Media 2.0 that might be interesting for people. It will be more important to measure what happens with audiences as we go into interactive media. I was just in Vietnam, as Karin was, and the Vietnamese government has installed software to track users of websites. And so if you log on to a certain website, then eventually the police follow a cumulative pattern in your traffic and show up at your door and they can arrest you. Does this show up on press freedom indicators? Because it's the user, not the producer of the media, unless this person also posts comments. Already there's this huge world of control that's opening up. At the same time, there's another world that could be regarded as more positive, because you have media for development being used on a massive scale that increases literacy, increases internet penetration among the poor, among rural underserved populations, and is being used for rapid poverty alleviation that is being recorded. Where is this happening? Well, the leading countries are China and Vietnam. So here's this paradox where people who had zero access to media have access to media for the first time, but they also have it accompanied by limitations in political expression. I think it's important to look at the broader picture in that regard. I'll close by saying that within this World Association of Newspapers study, I think people here will be fascinated with the data. We got information and survey material from 222 media managers from 66 countries. And one of the striking takeaways as we go through our final data analysis and the responses is that the majority of media managers in developing and emerging markets said that their biggest obstacle to their work was not restrictions in terms of censorship and government control. It was the absence of data and development on the business side. They didn't have audit bureaus of circulation. They didn't have advertising data, and they didn't have NGOs who were coming into these countries and helping them create these databases to run their businesses. So if they go bankrupt, as they freely express their opinions, they still aren't functioning media. So this is the very earliest pre-publication stage of this report, but my suspicion is that what people may take away from it is that this entire approach to metrics may be coming into a new phase where it will be broadened to include more economic and social indicators moving forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much to all the panelists. So let's open it up and take some questions or comments. And if you'd like to use the microphone there. In the meantime, I will kick off the questioning. Recently, I was involved in a project called Who Governs the Globe? And it was an attempt to wrestle around the question of who's a global governor? Who has authority in this sort of vast, disparate fabric to make judgments, set standards, and so forth. And I think this is mostly for Karin, but also Annie may want to weigh in on this. It strikes me that by being incorporated into the Millennium Challenge accounts, you've sort of crossed a border, a threshold, into, as Benedict Kingsbury would call it, a global administrative law. I mean, you're formally a governor, right? You're formally someone who sets standards for ways that you didn't, for uses that you didn't sign up to. And my question would be, how has Freedom House, and and perhaps we can compare and contrast this with CPJ, how have you handled this? This new designation, this new responsibility. You mentioned the delegations that you get in, and now you have to manage, I guess, some diplomatic duties. How has that changed you as an organization?
I think one of the main things it's done over the past 5 or 6 years, I would say, is and it's been very difficult because of funding constraints and personnel constraints and things like that, but we've really tried to increase the analytical rigor of our work, both of our main surveys. So that's led to several things. I would say a much more detailed editing process, sort of cross-checking, things like that. We've increased the teams of analysts for both publications. Some analysts, for example, used to maybe write 10 countries. Now it would be more like 3 to 5. So we have people really honing in on reports. The narrative reports are longer for both publications as well, so they're more detailed. They provide more nuanced analysis in terms of the narrative portion. I know a lot of the press freedom report sizes have probably doubled or tripled over the last 5 or 6 years. And we've also tried to increase the length of our ratings meetings and the number of people involved in the process in terms of the review process. So I've also tried to, for example, bring in local voices by sending out draft reports to local press freedom organizations as much as I can. So I think that's one of the main things we've tried to do, is really improve the analytical rigor and the detail that we're able to provide as well. So it sort of put us on our toes in terms of trying to improve what we're doing, because we realize that these scores are being used to make very big decisions about large amounts of money. So it's not just a very theoretical idea of like, oh, well, this country's getting this score and that's that score. You know, it really is having a big impact. So we're trying to sort of make sure that we are able to step up to the plate and defend our ratings. So if a government comes and asks us a question, we're able to really have all the evidence there and make sure we can defend it properly.
Yeah, thank you. Anne, did you?
Well, certainly the research firepower of this field has stepped up to an unimaginable level. When I started at CPJ in 1988, we were 3.5 people. When I left in 92, we were 12, and now I believe it's 22 with additional offices elsewhere. So just the sheer research capacity is phenomenal. And the other thing is that you build on your learning. I mean, we have all been part of a chapter of history that's been about creation of a body of knowledge and interacting with each other in international meetings and learning from each other. So So I think that when we go, I haven't been face to face with an angry government minister now for a few years. It's lots of fun. And usually I find that, or I would find that they were fairly poorly prepared, and that you could counter their protests with a few facts, and they wouldn't have much to respond. And in fact, sometimes you felt like you were informing them about problems of their country that they may not have been aware of. So there's almost an educational element in it as well. And sometimes I think privately you get the sense that they almost welcome learning about this.
Or might agree with you.
Or agree with you, yeah.
Some of them are just being sent there by their superiors to voice a complaint, but they may actually agree with what you're saying.
Very interesting.
I've had that too.
Jack.
Jack Snyder, I teach at Columbia. So I have a question about the consequences of media freedom. And so this is, I guess, partly a question for Lee, as a guy who has his fingertips on all the data sets and is up on all the studies. But it's also partly a question for Karin, as someone who works for an advocacy organization, is advocating improved media freedom, and part of advocacy, one might think, would be to make a case that improving media freedom actually does good things in the world. And so I have this fistful of questions about consequences of free media that I don't know the answer to, but that I have maybe hunches about. And so one is, what are the consequences of freer media for media quality? So we normally like to think that the freer the media, the better the information in the media. But we know that sometimes that's not true. So freer media in Burundi leads to more hate speech, or freer media in India leads to more kind of unprofessional vernacular language press outlets, where the quality of the information is, I don't know, maybe it's good, but maybe it's just rumors. What about the impact of freer media on the political tenor of the content? Are freer media more moderate media, or are they more radical media? The only study that I know that touches on this is one that Shibli Telhami did with Zogby, where they showed that in parts of the Middle East where you had more media outlets, you tended to get more radical media content because there was an outbidding effect. And Al Jazeera would have to be more radical to compete with the local radical TV station. Third one is political knowledge. So if freer media is going to do any good, you would think that one of the mechanisms would be that the consumers of the media would know more. And but 70% of the people who voted for Bush knew that there were, in fact, weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. So we know that free media doesn't necessarily produce great political knowledge. And so I'm wondering whether anybody has actually studied political knowledge as a function of press freedom. A fourth one is, is the effect of freer media that there's more consensus about either political facts or political opinions. Free debate, people agree on what the right answer is, the truth rises to the top, as John Stuart Mill said, or does freer media tend to polarize opinion? Something that I would think that you could just like crunch your way through a data set, but hopefully somebody has done this, but I haven't seen it. Fifth one, freer media. Is it more?
Here's the consequences of free questioning.
Is it more segmented, or is it more integrated? When you have freer media, do you just have more and more isolated little publics talking to themselves, as opposed to somewhat less free media where there's a national conversation. Anyhow, I have more questions, but I think I'll stop there.
So why don't we take 2 minutes each to respond to any of Jack's 5 questions, and we can take the rest up later. Lee, do you want to start?
Well, those are unfair questions because I think you know that the answers, we don't know the answers to them. But they are, I think, really important questions. The assumption that has been made in the media development area is that you pour a quart of media freedom in and you get democracy. I think there's no evidence to support that. The relationship is clearly much more complex than that. That if you have media independence, there are going to have to be other components to the society, other characteristics of society that are going to bring about the desired outcome in order to bring about the desired outcome. So simply having free media is not going to produce any of the outcomes that you've talked about. But I think that the questions you've asked is the right one because the series of questions are the right ones because they suggest that we really don't know very much about what the consequences of media freedom, press freedom are. We have, as I indicated in my presentation, we have looked at the relationship of competition and performance, and it appears consistent with sort of, I think, the presumption of your question is that when you have extraordinarily high levels of competition, what you have is, if that's accompanied with an inadequate supply of funding opportunities, an inadequately developed economy, that what you end up getting is a corrupt media system as opposed to a system that's really actually in service of society. So we have some data on that. Pittman Norris has been looking at some of the knowledge questions, and I don't think they're particularly encouraging me. The difficulty is that you need comparable measures. To take that example, you need comparable measures of knowledge across a large number of countries in order to be able to do the analysis. So, I think if we look at our own situation as we've had the change in this media environment, the proliferation of, if you simply take in the broadcast arena, the proliferation of broadcast outlets, we've had radically different political outcome. I mean, we have politicization of the television arena, which didn't exist 10 years ago. I don't think it's produced higher level of knowledge. You used the Iraq War example. I don't think it's increased the tenor of the political discourse. I don't think it's produced any integration of society. So that would simply be one case which would suggest that a higher level of freedom doesn't necessarily produce the desired outcome that you're speaking of.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with Lee on the comments about the U.S. We don't really look at any of these issues in depth. This is the kind of thing that I wish academics would do and use our data to look at some of these other issues. But I'll just make a few comments based on sort of what I've seen over the years. I mean, definitely I think increased commercialization and competition can lead to more sensationalism, more jockeying for stories and market share, and less professionalism, less responsibility, and less quality in some ways. So I definitely don't think there's necessarily a correlation with any of these things. What we have looked at Freedom House a little bit more is the relationship between press freedom and democracy, because we do have these two global indices, and there does seem to be we haven't really looked at the positive side, but on the negative side, there does seem to be a correlation where press freedom is seen as a lead indicator of broader declines in democracy. And in a number of countries, we've seen declines in our press freedom index, then followed by declines in the Freedom in the World Index, and showing broader political declines and declines in civil liberties more broadly. So that is something that we have seen sort of on the negative scale, that when press freedom is taken away, it can lead to broader declines in political freedom. And that's on the negative side, as I say. What we'd love to have more funding to do a broader study, or to have someone else do a broader study, which would really look at, let's say, is press freedom a lead or lag indicator of political decline in a positive direction. So do you need a broad political change or a broad opening in order to lead to a broad change in press freedom, or could changes in press freedom preclude broad political opening? But definitely on the decline side, it seems that in a number of different countries over the last 5 or 10 years, we have seen that press freedom is a lead indicator.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that I think you get into trouble looking at press indicators in isolation from the rest of societies. And for example, people can complain about the state of the media in the United States with justification, but it's also in an educational environment where a lot of our high school students can't find Canada on a map, much less Japan. And so you create a public market for media, and then the media serves the market it has. That's not generally a press freedom problem. It's a social problem. And Tocqueville, had as good a handle on it as anyone, and Postman had the second best handle on it. So if you look at civil institutions, government, how information circulates, what the role of entertainment is in society, whether there is an agora, a sense of civic involvement and engagement in a community where information serves that purpose, then that can be the platform that makes quality media possible. And without it, I think all the freedom in the world can still get you into the same cesspool of trivia.
If I can come back to the first of your questions, Jack, we do have one measure which speaks to the issue of media freedom and media quality, and that is in the IREX index, they have 5 indices, 5 subdimensions, and one of them is specifically a performance dimension. That is, they're trying to look at performance as a part of sustainability, but other parts of sustainability are not performance focused, and performance correlates highly with the other parts of the index, which speaks to the question of what's the relationship of freedom and economic viability to performance. They're at least within the IREX index, MSI, they're correlated. My recollection is pretty highly correlated, 0.8, something like that.
Great,
so that speaks to the first of your questions at least.
Please.
Thank you. My name's Israel Marquez. I'm a doctoral candidate in the political science department here at Columbia. And I have a question. I think it's mainly for Lee, but maybe for Karin as well. One of the things that struck me, and in your presentation, was your discussion of how business, the business environment that journalists find themselves in, may have an effect on press freedom. And one of the things that struck me the most about it is I was doing some work in Russia this summer, and I was told there specifically that especially in the regions, you have these very interesting dynamics where in some regions, the governor may simply buy a newspaper, something akin to what Fujimori did in Peru. But what's particularly more pernicious is the smarter governors in other regions would actually channel advertising funds from firms that they had access to or state-owned firms to specific media outlets in order to sort of, have an ersatz control of what they're publishing. And so one thing I wanted to ask you, Lee, is it seems to me like one potential way to get around this in constructing indices is perhaps to actually make use of these individual level surveys that you were discussing earlier. And so one thing I wanted to ask you is whether you think such a thing is possible, but also just because it seems like we don't, and this sort of gets to, I think, somewhat to Jack's point as well, because we don't really understand the dynamics of what individuals really think about their media and how that correlates to sort of broader press freedoms, whether you think such a measure would even be useful.
Well, I mean, I do. I think that public opinion component would be a new dimension and a valuable dimension to what we know about media systems in the country. So, I mean, I think the evidence so far is that that's something that can and should be added in the future when one's trying to understand a country and its media system. So to take the outlying cases, that you would have a situation where you had a Vietnam, which is a deviant case, Lithuania is a deviant case. These are places where the public is at odds with the professional evaluators, and I think that must tell you something about that media system. Either the media haven't adequately communicated their independence in one case, or they misled the public about what their capabilities are, or the government has misled the public about what their capabilities are in the other. And those are, I think, informative deviant cases. So you would gain something by having that part of the analytic structure, part of the index. The first part of your question, where I thought you were going, was a little different, and that is to really raise the question of what it is we mean by media freedom or media independence. And historically, it meant independence from government, and the indicators were focused on government constraints. I think what we're coming to understand is that the government is only part of what constrains the media environment, and maybe more important is the economic environment. If you have media that are competing in an economic environment where they cannot acquire the resources to function in what we would call professional fashion, there aren't very many options for them. So they're going to rely on hidden subsidies, government subsidies, political subsidies. The journalists are going to take bribes. There's no alternative to that. So if you really want to understand the viability of the media environment, you also have to understand the vitality, the capability, the sustainability of the economic environment for the media. And that, I don't think, has been really adequately addressed in the indices. Historically, the focus has been on the law, on the relationship of government with the press, as opposed to what I think we really want to understand about independence. And there's also quite a lot of work, particularly by Europeans, which is arguing that you have to have alternatives to a commercial media environment, media system. So most Europeans would argue that, to take Germany as an example, with a fairly complex public service media system, that's a counterbalance to the commercial forces, which would mean that the existence of that would make the German media system a more independent and a free media system than you have in the United States, where we have almost no alternative to a commercial operation.
Very interesting. Yeah, please.
I agree with Lee that traditionally the focus has been more looking at government controls and repression, but I definitely think that at the moment the Freedom House Index does look at some of these other issues. When we expanded and deepened our methodology in 2002, which I was involved with shortly after coming on at Freedom House, we did try and add in some of these economic issues. And at the moment we do, as I said, the categories are weighted somewhat equally political, a little bit more, and one of the main critiques I get of the index is that the economic issues are not weighted more heavily, but we do actually cover them. We do have questions on the economic side, looking at the impact of advertising and subsidies, and these could be both, by the government directing this, or private companies or interests or individuals. We also have questions on bribery and corruption and how that's impacting content. And we also have looking at issues of ownership, of concentration of ownership, of transparency of ownership, and of media sustainability. So we do cover some of these issues, although, as I said, some people argue that we should maybe weight them a little bit more heavily, but they do play into the index as it is now in the methodology. So if you look on our website and look at all the questions, you'll see a range of all the things we do cover.
One last quick question or comment.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Polner, and I'm president of Cinema Verite International, Inc. I'm glad you just noted the scenario of issues, because I have noted a specific issue, primarily because I'm in the business, I understand how it runs, and I'm going to move to Egypt, because in my mind, the information from Egypt was very skewed. It was all about freedom, and so the news runs a story and everything is freedom. But just recently, it's been noted that one of the CNN female reporters was gang raped. And if she was gang raped and assaulted, it meant that she was in the area where the so-called Democratic group was, because she never would have thought of going into the other area. This was not noted at all. The information on women, basically, was not noted. Every once in a while, there would be a camera that zeroed in on one woman.
Okay. Ma'am, can you phrase this as a question?
Yes, well, how do you define this when basically the media becomes thematic and they're not really, the real issues are not presented? There are themes. Half of the Egyptian population is illiterate. They never got near the internet. So this proclaimed as a free revolution was really not so. How do you examine that?
Okay, so this gets, I think, to some of Ann's point about possible hidden constituencies that might be out of the purview of media to begin with. Anyone want to discuss that? Okay, thank you.
Well, I actually think that we're in a period where almost everything we think we know about the media is open to challenge. All of our theorizing about media institutions is probably outdated. All of our understanding about journalistic routines is probably outdated. I think almost all of our literature is, if not, it's certainly open to challenge. And I don't have any answer to that, but it seems to me that honestly we have to say that this is such an incredibly dramatic change in the media landscape that almost everything we talk about needs to be reassessed, reconsidered, and rethought. And I think your question kind of suggests that.
Karin, in it?
Yeah, just to jump in, I mean, it is a time of huge change, and I think one of the challenges for us and for the other groups that produce the indicators is how to change and evolve and update the indicators to take into account these changes, but also to keep them enough the same so that we do have comparable data sets. And this is, I think, the most an issue for Freedom House because we have the longest data set. But is an issue increasingly for other groups as well. We have tried over the last few years to update our list of bulleted guidelines for our methodology questions, both to look at the impact of the internet and new media, as well as the changing landscape of journalism and how news production and consumption is taking place. So looking at bloggers, citizen journalists, as opposed to professional journalists, all the different ways in which people are getting their information now, via mobile phone, via the internet. So we're really trying to sort of tweak the methodology, but keep it within the same framework. Now, I don't know how much longer we can do this for, and we are thinking about trying to, have a broader, more in-depth discussion about our methodology going forward. So we'll see how it goes, but I think that is a challenge for all of us and all of these indicator projects, particularly I think in the media sphere more than, let's say, the democracy sphere more generally, just because it is such a changing environment and very, very fast.
I spent a lot of time writing about the relationship between legacy media and digital media, and they're both important. They're both really important. I spend a lot of time kind of defending the need to hold on to legacy media and news institutions that have reporters and editors and fact checkers and a way of defining the world. But one of the other attributes of legacy media is that they work within the framework of a master narrative. And when I was a reporter in El Salvador, I thought, okay, El Salvador owns the story because it's on the front page of the New York Times every day. And then all of a sudden it wasn't, and Poland was. And I realized at that point that stories have their shapes, their ways of being told by institutions, the ways of playing out in the world, and that is the world according to the New York Times, and we probably like it enough to read the paper. Now, I just experienced Egypt through Twitter, and I had a very fragmented representation that had many, many more points of view, many of them local, straight from Tahrir Square and elsewhere in the Middle East. But on the other hand, I wasn't sure what was true. I wouldn't know what was confirmed. Nothing was edited. And I had both halves of legacy and digital media at the same time, but I don't feel like it's a finished product. I feel that in 10 years we're all going to be looking at something totally different.
Yeah. Looking forward to that. So thank you all for participating. Thank you to our panelists for a wonderful discussion.